All right, well, good. Well, welcome. I'm having one of those days where it's 60 degrees outside in Colorado, but I'm freezing. My house is freezing. Like, I don't know what the problem. I feel like I should open the windows or something. So if I'm like shivering or my body language looks funny, it's just because I'm trying to stay alive in my living room. So don't mind that at all. But welcome, everyone. Thank you. Colleen, do you know how many people we're expecting? Did you ever get a sense of that or no? I know it's hard
Let
to
me check the appointment on my end. It looks like we had about 15 yeses and a few maybes, and a couple of people who might be a little late. So
okay,
I think we can. I think we can go
started.
ahead and get started. Yeah.
We have kind of a packed agenda, so I want to be sure we get through everything. So welcome, everyone. I am Catherine. I'm with Health Management Associates, and I'm Shannon. I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started and kick us off. Is that all right?
Yeah. Welcome, everybody. Shannon Breitzman, also with Health Management Associates. And let's go ahead and move to the next slide, Catherine. So this will be our agenda for today. We have about 3 hours with you all. And we'll take a little bit of a break about 12:15. Are we all on the same time zone today? I think we're covering.
It's Mountain Time and Central. And then I guess we have some East Coast probably with Safe States members.
Okay. So
but the region, our region is Mountain and Central Time.
Gotcha. Okay.
So this is Mountain Time zone.
Gotcha.
Agenda.
So yeah, so 12:15 Mountain Time. We'll take a little break. But we're going to start with a little bit of level setting, and I see some of my Colorado colleagues. So I know a lot of you, this will be very basic for you, but we want to make sure that we all kind of start with some basic information and knowledge. And then we'll move into really how do you operationalize a shared risk and protective factor approach? So how do you take this sort of theoretical information and really operationalize it in your day-to-day. We'll have a little bit of, didactic mixed with some interactive and small group work, and then we'll wrap up at about 2 Colorado time or Mountain Time. Oh, I keep clicking, Catherine, like I'm controlling the slide deck. I always do that. Control, and I'm not in control today. So this is the purpose of the training today. We really are hoping to develop some shared language and definitions for applying a shared risk and protective factor approach in the work of the states that are part of the Plains to Peak region. Catherine and I come from a background of using a shared risk and protective factor approach. Catherine and I worked together in Colorado, and way back when, feels like a million years ago, especially in pandemic times, because they feel like pandemic times added about 20 years for every year that we've been in the pandemic. And so ages ago, Catherine and I worked on this as it related to interpersonal violence and sexual violence, and first started talking about how can we use this approach in that work, and with our RPE funding, really started to do shared risk and protective factor work, and really just yeah, thanks, Barb Gavilli. Yes, pandemic added dog years to humans. That's right. And so we really used this sort of approach first in interpersonal violence, and then kind of started to explore it in violence and injury prevention in our branch in Colorado, and we'll share a little bit of that work in Colorado with you a little bit later. And then Catherine moved on to North Carolina and did more of that work in North Carolina, I think taking it into the, out of the state health department and into her work with the Domestic Violence Coalition and into the community sector. And now we're doing it at Health Management and working with states and how they can do it in their work. So, but what we really want is to, we can talk about our experience and how you apply it, but we also really want to hear from you guys and those of you who have experience, and then hear for those of you who don't, like what have been some of your questions and your challenges, and then together let's develop some shared language. Let's look at the next slide, Catherine. And so these are our intended outcomes for the training together. So again, develop some basic understanding and shared language of how this framework is being currently applied. So again, we'll share some examples. We want you to be thinking about what are the potential shared risk and protective factors, and particularly the protective factors, I haven't had enough coffee today, that you might focus on in your state. So thinking about your particular injury and violence prevention issues that you focus on in your state, or that are a priority for you, what might be the protective factors that you would focus on? We want you to understand this framework in the larger context of health equities. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We want you to understand the process of identifying your level of readiness for operationalizing this. So we'll talk a little bit about that and the paradigm shift that's.
Oh, Shannon, you froze. So while Shannon's, I guess, fixing her email or trying to figure out coming back maybe, I'll sort of pick up here. We're gonna talk.
Required in doing this kind of work.
Shannon, you froze. Are you back? I think not. So, all right. Well, we'll move on and see if she.
Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Now. Are you back?
Can you hear me?
Yes. I think you're in and out, Shannon.
Okay. Sorry, we're able today. I'm not sure. Catherine. Catherine, why don't you take over and I'm going to reconnect.
Okay, that sounds good. So
Okay.
We just also like to just hold a few ground rules, really just to make this space, you know, these virtual spaces still 10 months in, almost a year in, are I find sometimes still really awkward. So I find it helpful just to kind of acknowledge this, right? We're all most of us maybe are in our houses with pets, kids, partners, right? Lots of things happening. So stay as present as you can, but also take care of yourself, right? Do what you need to do. It's always better if folks are on camera, but we realize that some days are long Zoom days. Video exhaustion is a real thing. So also use your camera as you feel is okay with you. We'll move into small groups at least once. And so sometimes maybe if you're able to use it there, that's good. Step up, step back. We want to make this as conversational as possible. So feel free to speak at any point. If you're someone who talks a lot, maybe make sure that other folks are also getting a chance to share before you jump right in. Always want to be solutions oriented and think about what we can learn from each other and kind of co-create together. Definitely, if you hear something you like or you want to reinforce, we love the use of ditto to sort of build some consensus around ideas or thoughts. You know, this is even though we've been having this conversation for a while, there are lots of parts of this conversation that are new, right? In terms of figuring out how to do this, how to operationalize this, how to measure this. So we're trying to be open and still solution oriented. It's helpful if you can say your name when you talk, especially if you're not using your camera, so that we can sort of begin to connect voices and names. And then feel free to communicate in all the ways you have available to you, right? So jump off mute and interrupt if you want. Use the chat liberally, right? So we'll take turns monitoring the chat if we're not talking or explaining slides. And then also, I think Zoom just upped its game with its reactions, right? So you can always give a thumbs up. You can always say louder, quieter, faster. So so feel free to use any of the ways to communicate that. you have there. Sorry, I keep having to move your beautiful faces. I only have 2 screens here and I feel hobbled by only 2 screens. So there's a lot of open windows happening. So now we just want to learn a little bit about you. So we'll do this thing, we call it Chatterfall, which is what we'd like you to do is type in the chat box, but don't hit send or enter, I guess, until I tell you, right? So what we'd like to know about you is your name, your role, your program. So what state you're from, where you are, and then why is this important to you? What's your vision? What's your hope for what comes next for your state around shared risk and protective factor work? And then when I say go, we'll drop it in the chat, and then we can all take a look and see who's here with us and what kind of hopes are out there. So take a second to type. Yeah, Chatterfalls are fun. They're helpful. Okay, everyone hit go if you're ready. But they're helpful when you're trying to get people to spontaneously tell you what they think, right? Because without getting influenced. So we want to see real world applications, including measuring. We won't talk a lot about measuring today, Barbara Gabella, because it was hard to fit everything in. But there's some new resources. Safe States has a new resource that we'll point you to that have some good, I think a good place to start around measurement. Equity, that's a really, I think, aspirational and good goal for shared risk and protective factors. Safe kids, racial equity as a protective factor. We're gonna, we could spend days and days on equity alone, right? And sort of the intersection of equity and shared risk and protection and risk and protection in general. So we'll have an introduction of that. We'll have a short introduction to that a little bit later, but then certainly that's something that if your state is interested in talking more about, we can have that conversation. Connections across programs is sort of maybe the thing that we can say for sure shared risk and protective factors are really good at. More focus on protective factors. Welcome, Benny. Cross-program activities, we'll talk a little bit about that. Oh, I see what you're saying, Barbara, yes. Yeah, so, if you have light bulbs that go off, feel free to jump in and interrupt around measuring. Shared language, this is the place we always start, right? So this will be sort of basic potentially for some of you, but really the level setting is so that as you talk to each other and as you talk to folks in your programs, that you have the ability to understand what you're saying, right? Because you're using the same language. And we'll talk a little bit about, Shannon will talk a little bit about that, I think, as we go. So thank you and welcome. And for those of you, I know there are a couple of you that have seen this before. Some of this presentation will be familiar. Feel free to jump in and add anything if I missed something or if it was just better the first time you saw it and you wanna add to that. So we are just spend a couple of minutes, and again, take yourself off mute or drop in the chat and what are you currently doing? What's happening? You talked a little bit already about what you hope to learn from the training. Some of you did, but maybe drop this in the chat or feel free to jump in, take yourself off mute and talk a little bit about what's happening or what are you trying to get started or what are you fully engaged in? And then how do you want to use today?
This is Jeannie from Nebraska. Can you hear me? I'm on headphones, so.
We can hear you,
okay.
Jeannie.
All right. Where I'm coming from on this is really, I focus mostly on protective factors, such as I look at policy as a protective factor because I'm in motor vehicles, so we always look at improving GDL systems. And also another protective factors involve parents. And so we work programming around involving parents as much as we can with their teen driver. And then policy again, just on just different levels of seatbelt use, things like that. So that's really, you know, when it comes to traffic safety, that's kind of right now what I relate to. I know there's more, but those are things, concrete things that I've actually worked on and been a part of. But that's what I hope to learn from this training is kind of what you do beyond that and what's really achievable beyond that. So.
Great. Other thoughts, other things that you all are doing or working on?
I'll jump in. This is Benny. Unfortunately, Monica, our PE director, could not be with us today, but she's doing a lot with shared risk and protective factors across her work with our sexual violence prevention program. And we've done some partnership with our suicide prevention program. We really are interested at the department, since we're trying to really strengthen our overall injury and violence prevention work, to figure out how we can do that more across the unintentional aspects. So I think this training is perfect timing.
Good. We're going to talk, well, you know, a lot of what we have so far, right? The most robust resources we have are related to violence, right? And intentional injury, but we'll introduce some of that maybe fairly quickly in the beginning. And then we do have some places where Shannon will talk about motor vehicles specifically, but then maybe we can spend some time in that sort of broader injury space that is outside of violence, particularly given what we expect from CORE, right? That's the place where you all will want some more thinking, or maybe some more places to talk to each other about the NOFO, or the whatever they call it now, that's coming, right? So we'll be sure to leave a little bit of extra space there for that conversation. Yeah, so again, this piece about evaluation. So Barb Gabella, you have some friends in the crowd. And like I say, we'll point out, and maybe Safe States can, when we get there, can describe a little bit about the resource that's there. And then CDC has a resource, but that's the place where I think we'll talk a little bit about kind of what is an approach and how do you think about evaluation relative to that. Sorry, I'm trying to look in the chat as I'm talking.
And I was just going to say, Catherine, if everybody continues to look in the chat and just share with one another, right? So if you have resources, or you have ideas, or there's something that you're also working on, please communicate with one another as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like there's some work happening in unintentional injury.
Yeah, and I think that's the place where, again, we wanna hold space for that conversation, right? Given we've heard a lot of that lately from states, so excellent. All right, so let's just start. This is the part that Shannon said. Some of this will be familiar and maybe a little basic for you all, but for a lot of states, it's just helpful. Particularly when you bring in unintentional injury folks and folks for whom applying the idea of risk and protective factors is a little bit new, right? Or at least not something that that they feel quite as comfortable with as other folks. And Shannon, I'm going to let you watch the chat while I go through these slides. So, this is, probably in some form or another all seen this before, right? But protective factors are those characteristics, right? Organic or contextual, that protect us from bad things happening or mitigate the impacts when bad things do happen. Risk factors are those things that make it more likely that bad things happen or make the impact of kind of negative experiences worse. And so but where we want to spend our time today is on shared risk and protective factors, right? So those risk and protective factors that impact one or more type of public health issues, right? So injury and violence, unintentional injury and intentional injury for the conversation that we'll have today. Risk and protective factors function at this, sort of multiple levels of influence in our lives. Has anyone not seen this before, the social ecology? Or is anyone one of those RPE directors who has this tattooed on their arms? Do we have any of those folks on the call today? Because it's always fun to run into them. But I also, I've been thinking a lot lately about both the social ecology, sort of the levels of the social ecology, but I've been returning returning back to this idea of the health impact pyramid. And I don't know how much does anyone use this a lot? Does anyone sort of think about this when they're designing programs or kind of advocating in your health department? So this was developed by Thomas Frieden, who is, I don't know how many CDC directors ago, maybe 3 now, that Dr. Walensky is here. I always say her name backwards. And so one of the things that we want to talk about, or that we want to think about, right? I like to show this, right? Because shared risk and protective factors are also, one of the most effective ways we have right now to begin to think about in much more concrete ways what we refer to as upstream prevention, right? So how do we get to these lower levels of the pyramid? How do we think about the places where we can have broader impact, right? We get closer and closer to having a population level impact through strategies like policy work, and focused on the structural aspects of people's contexts and lives that impact their health and well-being, right? And so this will come back to this, particularly when we talk about health equity. But it doesn't necessarily mean we want to not do anything at the higher levels of this pyramid, right? But we have to know that things get more expensive and the impact gets less broad as we get up into these counseling and education and clinical interventions, right? So they're not less important, right? We just have to think about a range of strategies across the pyramid, or I guess it's not across, up and down the pyramid, as we're designing our work, particularly when we want to meet in an intersection of applying a health equity lens to our public health work, right? So that requires us to do something very different when we think about public health interventions, because we can't, racism and it's not an individual level problem, right? And so you can't apply an individual level solution to the impacts of structural problems. And so that's one of the things we want to hold in our minds here. So we always start here with connecting the dots. And while this document is aging, I think that it's in a lot of ways aging well, right? I think it's still maybe one of the best visuals we have to kind of help really show what we mean when, or what we're able to, what we should be thinking about, I guess is the best way I want to put this, when we're talking about building programming or building interventions across programs in a health department, right? And so this is these charts, these sets of charts, for those of you who haven't seen them before, really across the top are the public health issues. I won't call them silos, because I think one of the things that we did this training in Washington a week ago or so, and someone said something I thought was really great, that when we call them public health silos, what we imply is that it requires some sort of intense structural change to get to work together, right? But really what we have are a bunch of fragments, right? Our programs are fragmented in ways where if we think about our work differently, it shouldn't require massive structural change to begin to work together, right? So we want to also put that out here. But down the left side are the risk factors. These are risk factors at the individual level of social ecology, and across the top are are public health issues. And the places where there are no X's it doesn't mean that there's not a connection there. It means we don't have research that supports the connection, right? So we look at those as opportunities, right? But just on its face, I think these charts are helpful in seeing the amount of opportunity that there is to work together, right? To build a program that addresses a risk or a protective factor that could impact a number of the priorities that exist in injury and violence prevention programs in health departments. So a full set of problem-solving skills, right? So that we can see how impactful having a lack of nonviolent problem-solving skills are across all of these issues of intentional injury, histories of victimization, and then substance use, right? So these are levers, right, where we can think about impacting a whole range of programming. Oops, where's my, at the relationship level, we see, as the research base fades out, right, we see more of these blank squares. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean there's not a relationship there. And for some of these, it's pretty clear that there is. And for some of these, we're not sure how that functions. But this is all based on what CDC called an evidence base at the time. And the thing I'll point out here that we've also, Shannon and I don't know how many states, Eva and Carly, we've done now, maybe 10 or 11 states where we've done an assessment, maybe not quite that many, but we've done an assessment and then done some training with them. And the idea of connectedness, right? I believe connectedness is now the holy grail of shared risk and protective factors, right? Because it shows up in so many different forms and so many different ways for all these levels. Again, as we go up the social ecology for risk, you see there are more and more blanks here, but still some pretty powerful information, both about well, not both about, but again, when I talked about these the kinds of risk and protective factors that address structural issues like economic opportunity and employment, right? Those are important levers. Neighborhood cohesion, right? And how neighborhood cohesion drives connectedness, right? When you're thinking about resources in communities, that can be really important. How do we get to connectedness? How do you make connectedness in a community? Can you build it? Does it have to exist? What's the recipe for that? I think is an important question that we're learning a lot about. And sorry, y'all, Shannon got bumped off again, so I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to do the chat and talk. So raise your hand if you put something in the chat and I missed it.
I can keep an eye on the chat too, Catherine, for you.
That might be helpful, just so I don't miss something important. Yeah, well,
I'm
I think so sorry, you guys. I'm on the phone. I just am waiting for my internet to come back. Sorry.
No problem. Yeah, I'm happy to watch a chat. And I think the only thing that really came up was Dana from Kansas was just asking about the recording and if it'll be shared out. So I was just responding to that.
Oh, sure. Yes, we will absolutely share the recording. And then at the societal level, again, this idea of harmful norms. And the other thing I forgot to point out that I usually like to point out is that there are a lot of these, right? Not a lot of these, but there are a few strategic risk and protective factors that interestingly they show up again, maybe not surprisingly, when we get to unintentional injury, right? When we get to motor vehicle, right? Gender is a really important one, right? And gender norms, really important one. Economic status, really important one, right? So there are ways that even though the core emphasis may shift, or you may have a different combination of programs in your health department than the ones that run across here, there's a lot of opportunity to share the work across both intentional and unintentional injuries. So unfortunately, as we get to protective factors, we kind of see the same thing, only more of it, right? So we see a lot less research. So we have much fewer options for protective factors, but you still see in 4 of these 8 we have some kind of measured impact, right? So problem-solving skills, pretty important, pretty big deal in this work. At the relationship level, family support, connectedness, there's a lot of ability. I think Jean, is that what it is? Jeannie? Yeah, so this is what you were talking about a little bit, right? The involvement of parents. And so how do you strengthen those connections across both intentional and unintentional injury? And then another form of connectedness, right? So school connectedness seems big when we look at the number of X's. Again, community connectedness, right? Another support there that's and then, there's some really interesting, fairly recent, the last few years research about community connectedness and its ability to protect people in communities from things like heat waves, right? From things that are sort of natural disasters, I guess you would call it, or natural dangers, public health issues. So the power of some of these is pretty big. When we think about how we want to choose, or as you think about going through your programming to decide what might be priority, risk, and protective factors. I show this slide here. This strategic vision is now in its last year, right? I think it's expiring this year. Hopefully we'll see another one out of CDC, I'm not sure. But I think it's a helpful document that I just like to point out because it, CDC did also, they did more than just sort of present the information, right? There's a lot of good information in this document that I think we can build off of in terms of a strategy for moving forward, or what they thought was a good strategy over the last 5 years. But for those of you that are earlier in the process, right, earlier in conceptualizing what this might look like for you, I think this is probably a good resource just to think about as you're figuring out what the options are and what questions you need to ask yourself and what might be potential actions for moving forward. So beyond the state examples that you'll hear today, we'll give you some state examples, but I think there are also there's a lot of conversation out there that can be really helpful in the beginning of the process of sort of figuring this out, or figuring out how you want to move forward. So Shannon, I know you can't see the slides, but we're on the NHTSA report. Do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yes, I will do my best. So Safe States, and I know we have Safe States on the call, and I know we have Mandy on the call, and Mandy is a coach for this project. So feel free to jump in as well. And Catherine, just advance the slides as I chatter along, and
Okay.
and hopefully what I'm saying will align with what you're showing. And I'll keep trying to log on. So Safe States and NHTSA partnered to look at shared risk and protective factor approaches as it related to motor vehicle safety. And really for the purpose of looking at stuff beyond just policy approaches or engineering kinds of approaches. So knowing that those things were effective, but what else could we be doing to increase motor vehicle safety? And in particular, looking at driver behavior change. So things like aggressive driving and impaired driving, so drug use and alcohol use. And so pulled together an advisory group of driving behavior, driver safety experts, some state public health representatives, and then Safe States, some CDC researchers, to really come together and just think about what this could look like and what the shared risk and protective factors might be. I facilitated that group, which is how I got involved, and had a lit review done that looked at the literature that could be found looking at shared risk and protective factors for these sorts of driving behaviors. And so the result of that was, Catherine, are we looking at the charts that are very similar to connecting the dots?
Yep, we're on the individual level shared risk and protective factors.
Awesome. So we took that, what came from that literature review, and organized it similarly to the Connecting the Dots document. And did you show the document that was published by Safe States by chance? Was that the first slide?
Yeah, the first slide is the cover
Okay.
to it.
Great. So, you all probably have seen that document. If you haven't, definitely check it out on Safe States website. And maybe one of our Safe States friends can put the link to that document. It's a great document, and it has all of the details behind this project and this effort, and really a public health approach to addressing driver behavior change and motor vehicle safety, and really bringing together, the motor vehicle side of things and traffic safety side of things with public health for partners who maybe haven't done that yet, or feel like they need other strategies for doing that. So anyway, looking at these charts, you can see that where across the driver behaviors there are shared risk factors, and then where there are shared protective factors. So where there are more than 3 shared factors, I think those for the risk factors are in red. Am I correct, Catherine?
Yes.
Great. And so you can see where across individual, and then as Catherine clicks through, you can see across the relationship level, the community level, and the societal level of the social ecology, where they're shared. And just like in intentional injury, the research shows less of those connections when you get further out in the social ecology. So, and again, it doesn't mean that the connection's not there, it just means that the research isn't there to show that connection. And then for protective factors, where there were 3 or more, I think it's shown in green, same across individual, relationship, community, and societal level factors. So what the result of that effort then was Safe States and NHTSA then partnered to fund 4 states to identify an initiative that they would implement, looking at influencing driver behavior change by implementing an effort that addressed a shared protective factor or risk factor. And so 4 states were funded. It was Alaska, Connecticut, Texas, and oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the 4th state. Mandy, help me out here.
Did you say North Carolina?
North Carolina, that's right. Thank you. And then we have coaches from the states who are coaching them on their initiatives. And we have regular calls where we kind of talk about their work. We had our first workshop in December where we did some logic modeling and started to talk about their action plans. And we'll have another workshop in the spring to really, touch base on how they're doing with implementation. The coaches meet with them regularly, but I think probably the most interesting thing, and again, Safe States or Mandy, if you want to weigh in on this, is how these approaches are relatively new, less so with intentional injury, but certainly newer with unintentional injury. And I think it's been an interesting journey for these states to not have sort of a program in a box to implement, right? To have to take a risk and try something new and know that what they're doing is really contributing to the field, but it's uncomfortable to do that, to step out and do something that's new and implement approaches that are that haven't been necessarily tried before, and to not have necessarily a roadmap for how to do that. So anyway, it's we're stepping out into unintentional injury with shared risk and protective factors, which is great. Mandy, anything that you would add?
No, I just put in the chat, ditto. You said it very well, that, basically they're wanting like a roadmap or some kind of type of a script, but they're setting the way.
Yeah. Great. So any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say exactly the same thing. Any questions or reactions or thoughts about this? I mean, they're helpful resources, but there's a lot packed in here. So I want to give you kind of a minute to digest or to ask questions about using these, or I don't know, anything that has come to mind.
This is Colleen. You may have said this and I missed it, but are the states like still in their planning stages to like select what kind of what strategies they're going to work on to address the protective factors or risk factors, or are they further along and have picked those out already? I'm just curious, what some of the states are doing for the actual strategy work.
Yeah, they are. They're past that stage, so they've identified their strategies. I think, as they were moving along, I think they've adapted some of their strategies, and I think COVID certainly forced some adaptation because some of what they wanted to do in person they were no longer able to do. But as an example, Alaska is doing mindfulness training to influence aggressive driving as a behavior. So that's one example. Mandy, for the states that you're coaching, do you want to give an example of what they're doing?
Sure. For example, Texas is working on the shared risk and protective factors surrounding teen driver safety. I guess I don't have it in front of me exactly what strategies or what protective factors they're focusing on, but I can look for it and get back to you.
And is NHTSA funding these strategies? Sorry if you said that already.
Yeah, I think NHTSA is providing funding to safe states, and safe states provided these mini grants to the initiatives in these 4 states.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Other questions or thoughts about this? If you think of any, just again, drop them in the chat or break in and we can loop back to this. Because I think this is probably going to be an important part of your conversation or your thinking, right, for this upcoming NOFO and maybe your work going forward as a whole. But we wanted to take a second. We're going to do 2 things next. We want to take a second to talk about what we mean by an approach. And Safe States has a new resource out around shared risk and protective factors called the Connections Lab. And I don't know if you all are, if anyone's not familiar with it, it's a resource that I would highly recommend. And Eva or Carly, if one of you could maybe want to drop a link in the chat, they can, just in case anyone doesn't have it. But one of the questions we get a lot, right? So I think Safe States reminded me they've done six assessments for 6 different states to look at their readiness to engage in shared risk and protection. I think Shannon and I have done at least training with that many states, but we've done a couple. We did a training for a different region, and then we did a training for a state level nonprofit, an injury coalition. And so one of the questions we get the most is like, what does this actually look like on the ground? Like, how do we do this work? And then the other thing we hear almost all the time in the assessments is we don't have a lot of capacity for new work. I don't know how we're going to do this because we don't. Our plates are already full. Even before COVID, right? Our plates were already full before COVID, and so we started to think about how to bring home the point that at least a lot of what we want to talk about is really not about new work, right? It's about how we are approaching, thinking about, measuring, talking about, building partnerships, right? It's how we're doing the work that we're already doing that is where the most of the shift will happen, right? That it's possible that a lot of your strategies will look exactly the same or very similar or get borrowed from programs, right? If your RPE program is doing effective interventions to look at and deconstruct toxic masculinity in schools, right? That's now something we understand we might be able to borrow, right, for a teen driver program or some other kind of intervention, right? So So an approach is really sort of how we think about this in a broader sense, right? So these efforts, we are thinking across multiple issues, right? We're thinking across population health outcomes, quality of life outcomes, that require interventions or that where we're applying interventions to impact sort of as low in that pyramid as we can get, right? Or as far out in the social ecology as we can get. But we're measuring against multiple things, right? So this is, we're hopeful, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but by adding this slide, we were a little bit hopeful that this is less overwhelming, right? That we're really thinking about how we're organizing our thoughts, and then moving into sort of small goals and small actions that are about alignment, right? And about partnership. So feel free to react to this if that's not true. And but this is, we really want to just kind of leave this framework in your head as we go forward, right? As we're talking about an approach, that what we mean is a philosophy and a strategy that's a little bit broader than am I implementing this specific program, right? Having said that, we want to talk about what those specific programs look like, right? We also want to give concrete examples of that. So Colleen, I didn't put a marker slide in here for you. So I don't know if you have a couple minutes you want to talk about just some concrete examples about Colorado, like thinking about the relationship between data, right? So we have existing data, how to use that data and then move to action or move to building programs based on that. And anyone from Colorado, I prepped you, Colleen, so I don't know if you prepped someone else.
Yeah, no, I will start, and then if anybody has anything to add in, I'm totally open to that. But I did just want to first comment that I put in the chat that I like that previous slide with the definition of the shared risk and protective factor approach, because I think it broadens it outside of just injury and violence prevention outcomes. And I know that that's been you know, part of our work, especially as we've partnered with our chronic disease prevention programs. And so, and I know other states have done that too. So I just was calling that out. But for some of our examples for building prevention programs using data, I'm going to talk about two examples that came to mind as I was thinking about this request to chat about our work in Colorado. So one is on child maltreatment side, and the other is actually on motor vehicle and kind of ongoing work. But so Colorado is one of the funded Essentials for Childhood states, which is a child maltreatment prevention funding opportunity from CDC to build safe, stable, nurturing environments and communities. And we were funded the first round of funding too, which was more of a collective impact approach. But in the second round of funding, CDC really wanted to focus the work around changing community norms and building economic security for families. So we knew in Colorado when we were applying for this this funding opportunity that we wanted to focus on the protective factor of economic security and supports for a few reasons. One, if you've seen our strategic planner in Colorado, it's one of our shared priorities for our branch. Or I know Deanna from Utah appreciate this direct, but one of our super protective factors. It cuts across a lot of our outcomes in our branch. So we knew we wanted to focus on that. And then it's also part of the CDC's technical package for preventing child maltreatment. And it was actually required in the notice of funding opportunity to work on economic security and supports. So knowing that this funding opportunity for EFC had limited funding and limited money, we really, when we were applying for the grant, we looked at a lot of data to prioritize which communities to work on. So that included, and I actually was like going into our grant application folder from 2018, but we have like records of looking at data from our child fatality prevention system. We looked at rates of child maltreatment. We looked at human service program data, so enrollment, and I guess also health department, but enrollment in food security programs like WIC and SNAP, enrollment in the Colorado Child Care Assistance Program data to really look at the gap in the number of people and families enrolled versus who are eligible. And then we also looked at which risk and protective factors were prioritized by communities in Colorado that were implementing the communities that care approach, as well as readiness data for counties who were already doing some child maltreatment prevention planning work through the Department of Human Services and a grant through the early milestones, which is a child maltreatment prevention organization here in Colorado. So based on that data, we decided to narrow down to 5 counties to focus on the work for the grant, and we are currently funding local public health agencies in those counties to do some economic security work, specifically around increasing enrollment in WIC, SNAP, and the Colorado Child Care Assistance Program, just knowing that that strengthening these economic supports for families in those counties has the potential to reduce child maltreatment as well. And then this, I also, just as I was thinking about this, this example, I did want to add that this is actually also an example of where we've braided and layered funds in Colorado, which is also kind of a key component of shared risk and protective factors approach, shared risk and protective factor approach, especially how we've operationalized it in Colorado. And I know that I think in the level setting, HMA will talk a little bit more about that later this morning. But just as an example, in this work is funded by federal funds, so the Essentials for Childhood Cooperative Agreement, as well as our Overdose Data to Action grant. And actually we're supporting some of the work through CORE State Violence and Injury Prevention Program as well. And we're also funding using some state funds through the Child Fatality Prevention System. So that's one example. Do I have time to share another one, Catherine? Is that okay?
I think so, yeah. You have another quick, yeah. You have
Okay.
Another
so another one, it's more ongoing and a little bit like newer. We're still figuring out, but I think it actually overlaps well with the work that Mandy and Shannon shared around motor vehicle safety. And so for our motor vehicle safety work, we're also eager to do more upstream work for the prevention of motor vehicle related crashes and fatalities. And our motor vehicle safety program manager took a look at our Healthy Kids Colorado survey data, which is the Colorado version of our youth risk behavior, YRBSS. I don't know the full acronym, but I'm sure you're all familiar with it.
Behavioral survey. You got
Okay,
it.
yeah, I was like, I have it written out, and I'm like, I feel like I'm missing something. But risk behavioral surveillance system. Thank you, Felice. So she looked at that data and cross-tabulated the protective factor data in there that is specific to school-based protective factors, family-based protective factors, and then peer and individual protective factors, and cross-tab them with motor vehicle-related risk factors. So, you know, like some of the risky driving behaviors that are tracked in there, like driving with someone who is impaired or has used substances. I'm not savvy enough with every item in there, but she did a huge like cross-tabulation project with this. And then found associations among the data showing that with those protective factor data and the risky driving data, and then used that data to propose to our Department of Transportation, who oversees the Highway Safety Office and the NHTSA funding for motor vehicle safety, to fund upstream prevention strategies that specifically promote connectedness and then shifting social norms. And this is, you know, all in the works within the last couple of weeks, and the hope is that in the upcoming funding cycle for them, which our RFA gets released in March of this spring, that there'll be opportunities for people to apply for implementation funding based on strategies that are actually also aligned with our communities that care menu strategies for promoting connectedness. So that's a quick example, and like I said, we're still kind of in the works, and seeing the PDF that you shared is a good reminder for us to like present that data back to NHTSA as well, so that they can, you know, fully get on board with this idea, because it is a shift, I think, in how NHTSA's funded motor vehicle safety programs previously. Does anybody have anything to add from Colorado or other examples too? Or questions?
No questions about any of it? Okay, well, that was a lot. So what we thought we would do next is give you, oh, chat, let me see. So it creates opportunity to think about working with those already doing programming, after school programming, to introduce traffic safety and resources. Yeah, again, this is a really important point, right? So capacity is limited all over the place, right? So where are the efficiencies that we can build in either partnerships or program content and measure against that? So I think that's a great point. What we'd like to do is to give you now just some time to kind of sit with this. I know the beginning of this is always a lot of information, you know, kind of presenting all that. So we're going to do, let's see what time it is, probably do about 10, I don't know, 7 minutes, 10 minutes in small breakouts, and just give you all a chance to talk to yourselves or talk to each other, I guess, not talk to yourselves, but talk to each other. And here's some questions, I think some guiding questions around. So exactly this, what did we just talk about, or what did you just hear, either the examples or some of the projects or new funding potentials that make you think about your work differently? If you want to, I'm not sure the sort of politics of talking about the NOFO amongst yourselves, whether it's super competitive or super collaborative. So we can tiptoe around that one in your groups. But then, you know, again, what do you need, right? What do you need from each other? What do you need from the region? We'll come back to this conversation about what you need, but just might be a place to sort of hear each other's challenges and identify things. So has anyone not used the breakout function in Zoom yet? That's right, Lindsay, everyone in the region should get funded. If we had it our way, then yeah, everyone. Well, welcome back. Hopefully those were good. We want good conversations. We want to spend a few minutes maybe just talking, maybe, I don't know if we won't do a formal report out, but although that's what I called it, but let's talk about what you talked about, or where you are, what you're thinking at this point.
I can share. I will admit I was in a breakout with Barbara and Teresa, so we mostly just spent the time catching up a little bit. But Teresa, if it's okay to share, I mean, I think that because Utah has been, you know, working with HMA on and kind of figuring out implementation of your strategic plan, there's some opportunities to restructure your programming in programs based on the shared risk and protective factor approach. And Utah is similarly organized as Colorado, where both injury and violence and overdose is all, you know, kind of under the same organizational structure. So, and we've connected in the past to share with each other on how we can like learn along the way. So it was good to catch up.
Good. Yeah, and one of the things that we're doing with Utah, and maybe that Utah can talk about this a little later, and we've done with other states, is actually build out a theory of change, right? So actually work with states to kind of build that out for their shared risk and protective factor work. And I think that's a really helpful step in driving that kind of organization or reorganization, I guess.
It has been. Sorry, I had to step out for a minute. So yeah, it absolutely has been. Thanks, Catherine and Colleen.
What else? What did other groups talk about?
I'll jump in. One of the things that came up in ours was that while we all are working toward this idea of how do we do this shared risk and protective factor approach, we're also thinking, is the NOFO, you know, speculating here, going to focus on ACEs, and where's that data we have for that? And we talked a little bit about some states that done BRFA's ACEs questions, but really just that we're all just jumping in, and it may be that we have to think of how do we just start that process through this core application, but that was the gist of it. Others can offer, but that was my sense.
any new ideas? Was there a very like, any group have a lot of alchemy, or are there a lot of just, I don't know, creation energy going on, or is it just too close to lunch? Your sugar low is
Friday, no alchemy on a Friday. People are like, no more alchemy on Friday.
And 10 minutes is hard too. You need some time to get the creative juices going, I think.
Yeah. All right, well, let's, why don't we do this then? Why don't we take a break? What we're gonna do is we'll take a little bit of a break, right? So everyone, it is Friday and a lot of packed Zoom days if your life is anything like mine. So let's come back at about 12:30, maybe 12:24, to so we can get started at 12:30, and then we'll talk a little bit about readiness. Safe States is going to talk about readiness. We'll talk a little bit about kind of like what does it take to get started. So Benny, a little, kind of what you were talking about. Well, and then we'll talk a little bit about health equity. So take 15 minutes, get some food, whatever you need, stretch, and we will see you back here shortly. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. It's hard not to just goof around. And it's Friday.
Careful, you're still being recorded.
No, I know. I'll say it on the recording. People know. Are we going to record the break, or I guess we could splice it out in Camtasia or something?
Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'm sure Allie could help us with that.
Allie can do the tech stuff. I make her do that from some other thing.
Do that though, because I forgot to turn it off during the breakout groups, which means you have like 15 minutes of.
Yeah, I didn't even think about it until just now. I'll ask if you want, Catherine, you can share it, because I think it'll save on your Zoom account or your computer, and then if you just share it with me, I'll work with Allie to help figure that out, because she's done that before for us.
There, that's good. So it may be helpful just to give a minute or two background, Eva and Carly, on sort of how Safe States and how we know each other, right? How we work together to do this work, so that to give a little context for this. But I'll turn it over to you all. Just give me a heads up when you want a new slide.
Sounds good. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, so my name is Carly Roberts. I'm a program coordinator with Safe States. And I work with Eva. Eva, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hey, this is Eva. I'm also program coordinator with Safe States. I'm in Durham, North Carolina.
Yes, and I'm in Washington, D.C. And I know that Catherine just mentioned that we're hilarious and that we can entertain you. But the only thing that I can entertain you with is potentially train horns going by or my dog barking. So that's just sorry to disappoint. But yeah, so I mean, we work with HMA on the shared risk and protective factor assessments that I know a number of the states, you guys are already either have worked on it with us or are in the process. So, we kind of collaborate with HMA to put together this assessment that then usually leads into the training that HMA takes over. So I don't know, Catherine, are you looking for more background than that, or do you think is that good? Okay.
Yeah, no, that's just to sort of that to stage, when we talk about the training pieces, but also we wanted to talk to you all a little bit about the readiness part of it, to just show you the whole process, right? Just show you what Safe States is, the part of the process that they engage in, and then how that drives the way that the work that we do specifically with states. So that's what Eva and Carly are going to talk about now.
Yeah, all right. So in terms of the readiness assessment, we work, as we mentioned, we work collaboratively with HMA we put together this assessment to address how ready states are to take on a shared risk and protective factor approach to their work. And, you know, the importance of readiness, this really comes from a need across the country. Public health professionals really face the need to implement programs more effectively and efficiently, while also demonstrating meaningful outcomes. So this need is pretty urgent in IVP, as all of you know, especially given the epidemics of suicide, interpersonal violence, opioid abuse, among others. So there's been a significant push in recent years to address shared risk and protective factors by multiple forms of injury and violence to have the most significant impact in reducing incidence and prevalence of injury and violence. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but applying a shared risk and protective factor approach will allow IVP staff to really raise the bar for program outcomes and work more effectively and work in ways that really address issues in more comprehensive ways. So utilizing the shared risk and protective factor framework is an approach to public health prevention that really acknowledges a shift in the way that we accomplish work. So the fundamental question at the root of our efforts should really no longer be how can we address a single specific public health issue. And instead we should really be asking how we can contribute to the development of a system that supports well-being more holistically. So in that light, where, you know, the goal is really to increase accessible resources to proactively prevent multiple public health issues, including issues that may not currently exist. And that really improves the context in which people live out their lives. So more broadly, this approach is not only relevant to injury and violence prevention, but also to public health and well-being. And there's definitely been an increased emphasis on the shared risk and protective factor approach through really formal and informal mechanisms, funding opportunities, definitely for state health department IVP programs from federal partners, namely obviously the CDC, have placed a pretty strong emphasis on incorporating that shared risk and protective factor framework into state IVP work. So while internal and external stakeholders are generally supportive of a shared risk and protective factor approach, there's a growing evidence base for it, as many of you know. We're seeing many health departments experiencing challenges kind of taking this more theoretical approach and really translating it into, say, practical activities for implementation. That's something we hear a lot with the states that we complete the assessment with of, you know, we understand it conceptually, but how do we move from the conceptual to the operational, which I know Catherine and Shannon really address in the training. But ultimately, by assessing this readiness of state health department IVP programs to adopt a shared risk and protective factor framework to their work, we're thinking that we can really meet them where they're at and prepare them to tap into more increased opportunities for funding to support incorporating a shared risk and protective factor approach into their IVP efforts. So, you know, there are several things that go into our assessment of readiness to take on this work. So we talk about attitudes and beliefs from internal staff and external partners, understanding of shared risk and protective factors and related frameworks from both conceptual and operational perspectives. We look into organizational culture of both the IVP group and with partners, including, you know, communication, acceptance of, you know, innovative approaches, partnership. We also talk about what resources are available to the injury and violence prevention programs and what barriers exist. And, you know, there are many barriers that Eva will kind of go into a little bit more that are very, that kind of occur for all states. And then we get into some specific state level barriers that can hopefully be addressed with training. And so I guess, Catherine, if you want to go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about kind of the process for the approach. So first step with the assessment is we like to align on goals. So Safe States, HMA, and the state team will kick off by really discussing the overall assessment and training process that we're covering here. We typically ask states to come prepared with their goals for the assessment and training. Goals can really range depending on where kind of on the continuum of adopting a shared risk and protective factor approach a state is. Wow, that is a mouthful every time I say it. We gotta shorten this somehow. There's your humor for the day. So some states are definitely really early in the process and they want to kind of take a pulse check on where staff and partners are on just general understanding of shared risk and protective factors. Other states, on the other hand, feel very comfortable with the concepts of shared risk and protective factor and maybe just want a little bit more information about how to operationalize or strategize with their existing program work. More advanced states typically want to use this as an opportunity to expand on the work that they're already doing. So the reason that we kind of like to align on the goals at the start is because states are kind of, you know, all over a large spectrum. And ultimately the goals that drive are the assessment and the training plan. So some states, specifically the ones that are earlier in their understanding, choose to do a training prior to the assessment, so the assessment can more accurately completely measure how well their staff understands concepts. Other states kind of choose to do the assessment first so that HMA can fully form the training to address what was found. That's probably the more common approach that we've seen. We've also seen states do a combination of things with that. So first step being aligned on goals so that we can all be on the same page about really forming the assessment to the needs of the state who's doing it. So the next step is finalizing the assessment details and tools. So the assessments are really fully customizable to the state, as I mentioned. So while we always administer surveys and conduct interviews as part of it, we at Safe States work with the state to develop the tools and process in a way that makes sense most for them. So we'll provide survey and interview tools for the state to react to and update as needed. So if there's like a really specific question that the state wants to know, that if like their partners, you know, how their partners feel about X, Y, and Z, we can incorporate that. You know, the state will provide us with a list of individuals that they'd like to receive the survey. There's no number limit on that. And then they also provide us with a list of people that they want us to personally interview. And so we typically have different survey and interview questions for both internal staff and external staff partners. But again, that's something that's fully customizable depending on what the program looks like. And then third step being that we administer the survey and conduct interviews. So those are really the main pieces of the assessment. Is we have a very broad survey, or not a very broad survey. We have a survey that we use to develop, you know, understand the trends of how ready the state is in terms of both their partners and their staff. And then we also conduct the interviews over a several week period with these key informants. And those are really used to add context to the results and the trends that we see from the survey, as well as capturing some dissenting views that may not, you know, pop so much in the survey. We think that it's often really good to understand where people who don't necessarily follow the trend of everyone else kind of stand on this. And so we like to incorporate that into the assessment as well, so we get a really full picture. And then the final step being, you know, analyzing the data and finalizing the report. So following the survey and the interviews, Safe State staff, we begin the analysis. We use the survey to inform the trends, as I mentioned, and the interviews to add context and highlight things. And then we write the report, share it with the team, with the state team and HMA, and then kind of use that to move forward with training. So that is generally the process. I know that you know, we're currently working on one with Nebraska, Utah, we've done one with you before. So if anybody has anything that they want to add at any point, feel free to jump in from your own personal experience. Yeah, so I'll pass it along to Eva to talk about some of what we've learned from all of you so far.
Yeah, thanks. So if you can go to the next slide, Catherine. So we have done 6 assessments so far. 2 of them are, I think, in process right now. Over the course of the last, I want to say 1.5 years, I might be off. COVID time has made me not understand how time works anymore. So that being said, we've learned a lot from a lot of different views of states. And so when we were thinking about what to present to you guys today about the assessments, one of the things I thought about is let's just share a little bit about what we've learned from all of these different states and what some roadblocks have been that are pretty common, and then what are some accelerators that have helped move this work forward. So one of the first things that I will reiterate 1,000 times about this work across the states is that there's just a spectrum of work happening across the country in terms of shared risk and protective factor approaches. So some states are just entering into this work. They're just learning about, you know, the terms and what it means and how it connects. And then there's other states who are really in the trenches with it and developing theory of change models for their strategic plan and connecting this work with their specific programs. So there's a whole spectrum, and even within departments and within IVP programs, there's a spectrum. There's people who are new to it, who are just learning, people who feel really comfortable using the terminology. My biggest takeaway is wherever you are, it's okay, because there's a spectrum. It can be sometimes scary to think that you should know more than you do know or you don't know. So it's okay. We're all learning together. The next thing that's kind of fairly common across the state is that language is confusing. And understanding and explaining and connecting the terminology around shared risk and protective factors and upstream prevention work can be really confusing. And we hear this across all of the states. There's a lot of language barriers when it comes to shared risk and protective factor work. And then relating it, especially to our partners who may not be as entrenched in this work or use this language as often, it can be confusing to then get on the same page. I think I pulled out a quote from one of the reports and it just resonates with me. And somebody said, you know, the #1 barrier we're facing right now is terminology. What public health uses versus what transportation uses versus what public safety uses. When they talk about upstream, is that meaning the same thing as root causes? Is that the same thing as risk and protective factors? This is a common reaction across the state. Time and money are scarce. Also, this is common across states and by far is the biggest barrier to this work. In almost every state, we hear about time issues and money issues. Developing shared risk and protective factor approaches really requires IVP professionals to be more innovative in the way we approach this work. And I think one way that we try to encourage states to think about this work is reframing limited capacity as a shift in priorities. And then we've also very commonly hear or tend to draw parallels that people typically understand the why of this work, but not the how. So states want to see applicable examples to a shared risk and protective factor approach, something that makes the concept less abstract, which might be why you're here today. It might be why you want to pass this on to partners. The concept can be very abstract and states really want to see applicable examples. That is a common theme across. So let's see, yes, perfect, thank you. All right, so roadblocks. These are just a few of the roadblocks. I'll say there's obviously each state is different. So there's different roadblocks depending on where your state is. But these are just a few that kind of tend to come up quite a lot or we hear commonly from state to state. The first being that our programs are tied to funding. So across states, we often hear the issues that we're siloed in groups based on funding streams, or this is the way it's always been done, or I don't feel this way, but my partners that I work with don't seem able or willing to focus on areas outside of their area of expertise. So this idea of silos and programs being tied to funding can definitely be a roadblock to this work, and it's something that we hear on a regular basis in the assessments. So some things just to think about if this is something that is resonating with you that I've found in just the interviews and the assessments in general, is that this siloed culture, even though you may be very siloed in your funding streams, it's often not as apparent to outside partners. Usually outside partners don't see your injury program as being as siloed as you yourself may see it. Another thing that's, might be helpful to think about around this is just disassociating your emotions from your work, which I know as public health professionals is so hard because we're all passionate about the areas that we work in, and that's a really great thing. But sometimes that makes it hard for you then to look at the bigger picture and to connect that to something that isn't suicide prevention specific, but larger than that. So maybe thinking about ways to pull your passion into the larger picture can be helpful. Siloed work and overlooked overlaps in prevention strategies. So because our programs are often tied to funding, there tends to be more siloed culture. This often leads to overlooked overlaps as I call them, in prevention strategies. That's when people doing similar work aren't always aware that they're doing similar work. And this can happen within your own program. It can happen with the health department. It can happen with your partners. You know, you don't even know that you're doing the same work. And this is a common roadblock that we've seen to shared risk and protective factor work. People are always willing to collaborate, but they just don't have the time, and it's not as intentional as they would like for it to be. So things that have come up as suggestions to try is just communicating and fostering a sharing culture. What I say is, when in doubt, overshare and be explicit in explaining the work you're doing, especially shared risk and protective factor work. Be explicit in how your work is connecting to an upstream prevention, and asking questions about to partners about the work that they're doing, and drawing connections together can be helpful, and just getting over that overlooked overlaps and start working together a little bit better. Buy-in from leadership, staff, and key partners is obviously a roadblock. This can be very hard to overcome. Even this includes working with advocacy work, or with legislature, and it can also include buy-in from those working in secondary and tertiary prevention. This can be especially difficult because you're, again, speaking somewhat of a different language than them. This creates roadblocks in work. So some things to think about is just being open and flexible with these partners to achieve the shared goal. Make sure how their work connects to your work, and vice versa. Often gaining buy-in from those partners can be a foot in the door. And then final roadblock that we seem to see across states is just not connecting the cultural roots of shared risk and protective work and where it stems from. So often I'll hear from partners, this is nothing new to me, or you're just using terminology for work we've been doing for decades. I think sometimes that can get lost when we're talking about shared risk and protective factor work, that this is nothing new. This is work that has been done for decades. And it's important to note the impact that oppression and discrimination play in this work. Shared risk and protective factor approaches are rooted in health equity work, and this means that we have to acknowledge the systems of injustices that exist to move this work forward. It's also important to acknowledge that specific populations are actually culturally rooted in approaching prevention through multiple factors at the same time. So Indian communities have been working with these issues for decades. Community health workers and grassroots workers have always focused on holistic care. This kind of work is nothing new to them. Okay, we can move, thank you. Great, so accelerators to this work. Being here is a great starting place for accelerating this work, reviewing existing materials. I'd also say the assessments that we do is a great starting place. Knowing what work is being done in your state is certainly around shared risk and protective factor work is certainly a great place to start, and our assessments can help with that. It's also important to look at publications like Connecting the Dots, which we went over, the Safe States Connections Lab. I would have to shout that out because the materials are there, and it does help you think through what is a shared risk and protective factor approach. What does that look like? What are some other examples that exist out there? What are the other frameworks of states that are doing this work? So anytime you can review existing materials definitely helps you accelerate this work forward. I'd also want to add in racial equity assessments and trainings. That can also be materials that can also be a valuable resource to help move this work forward that people may not often think of. building your shared risk and protective factor vocabulary. So make yourself and your staff comfortable with shared risk and protective factor vocabulary. One thing we hear is that shared risk and protective factor approaches are extra work. But there's often already shared risk and protective factor work happening within your program. It's just a matter of weaving that language into the work that you do every day, and connecting what you're doing with that language. Ongoing communication should definitely include admin and data staff as well. Bringing them into this kind of language that we're using helps bridge gaps and makes it a little bit clearer to the whole staff. I'd also suggest when writing grants, using shared risk and protective language as much as possible. That's definitely an accelerator to this work. And again, crosswalking your language that you use around shared risk and protective factors with whatever your partner is talking about. So a lot of times you'll have a partner who says, we don't do shared risk and protective factor work. Our focus is on health equity. So explaining to them how those two connect can be really useful for building buy-in and moving forward. This kind of goes hand in hand with the next thing, which is connecting your own dots to shared risk and protective factor work. If you don't know how shared and risk and protective factors connect to your work, research and connect your dots. Take the time to research what shared risk and protective factors are. Take time to think about the work that you do and think about how they connect. Having applicable examples to a shared risk and protective factor approach make the concept less abstract. So if you can take the time to do that for your own work, it makes it easier to explain this work to your partners and again, to build that buy-in with them. Again, the Connections Lab is a great place for you to go to help with that kind of process. Yes, so, and the next piece is, sorry, I have two different slide sets up. Connection to health equity. So it's helpful for states working on shared risk and protective factor approaches to understand how their work relates to social determinants of health and health equity work of partners. We define shared risk and protective factor approaches as impacting the social determinants of health in a ways that are positive and equitable. Being able to speak to that in a way that resonates with your partner, again, connecting your own dots to this will help in explaining your role in health equity work. And then the last piece, the last accelerator that seems to help with states doing this work is just starting small. Pilot Works is a great pilot work, or working with one coalition, or developing a strong shared risk and protective factor approach in one area of your IBP program might make it more feasible. So ACEs is often a good springboard into shared risk and protective factor work, and finding those who are already working in ACEs can be helpful to help you build and work on broader shared risk and protective factor strategies as that work evolves. So there's quite a few accelerators and roadblocks. I could go on and on, but I won't because we've got limited time here. I know that Utah's on the call. Deanna, I see you left a little comment about the training and the readiness assessment. I know you all have worked through your own roadblocks and accelerators to be where you are. So if you guys have any insight on where you are in this process, would love to hear it. And thanks.
Yeah, I think you did a really great job just kind of explaining, I don't know, you were going through like the pros and cons and I was like, oh, that's very, very close to Utah's results and just kind of what we found as well here in our own state. I think that we've used the assessment as kind of like a springboard, both for training and for getting leadership on board. It kind of just like put our feelers out to multiple partners who, maybe didn't know as much about shared risk and protective factors. It was almost an opportunity to educate or get leadership involved as well, which I think was really, really great. And we've just kind of continued to work with our partners on this as well. So nothing Nothing amazing to say, but I just think it's a really good way to kind of ground the work that you're doing. One of the challenges definitely that keeps coming up in Utah is just the idea that, you know, our partners have very siloed funding, so it's very hard for them to work on projects in a shared risk and protective factor manner unless we fund them to do shared risk and protective factor work. So I think that's kind of one of the biggest changes that has come out of the assessment and training relationship.
We have managed to we have managed to partner with a couple of partners though to braid some funding around projects. So we are moving in the right direction. It just is a slow process.
Ooh, Catherine, you're on mute.
I was just going to add, sorry, I lost contact during the very end as soon as I said thank you. So if anybody had anything to say, I missed that. I got the very end of Deanna's. Thank you for sharing y'all's experience. I appreciate that. Yeah, thanks y'all.
Oh, thank you. Questions for Utah or for safe states or thoughts, reflections on readiness?
I have a question. This is Jason. She mentioned getting leadership on board or getting leadership involved. And I just wondered how high up the leadership they went or they attempted to do that.
Teresa, I don't know if you want to talk about this a little more.
I'm waiting here to see if you're going to talk first. Sorry. So at this point, our bureau, which is the Bureau of Health Promotion, and it has most chronic disease programs in it. They are also developing their plan to be shared risk and protective factors. So we've been able to collaborate with them in what the work that we're doing, and then some of the other programs like tobacco are working on some of the shared risk and protective factors that we aren't working on. So they've been, for example, they've been working on a homelessness project. So I think that it's good that, so our bureau director has just moved up to our division director. We know we have her support. So I don't know what that looks like at the division level. Our Bureau of Epi is in that division, our Office of the Medical Examiner, a couple of other programs. So I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but I know we have the support going up to the division. And we're one of the bigger divisions in the health department.
Okay, thanks.
What about Colorado? Do you have insights, Colleen or Lindsay, about engaging leadership?
I can chime in. I mean, I think it does take some time. And, you know, Shannon and Catherine and others on the call know this better than anyone, you know, like a broken record for like 20 years and, you know, you can get to where we are. But I think that one of the things that, you know, I certainly have learned over the years is, you know, once you get your team sort of understanding this concept and your immediate team, that then you can really be, I think, a little bit more nimble in how you talk about the work and what ideas you have, because it becomes less about trying to prove like, okay, we got to use the shared risk and protective factor approach, and more about what's the win-win. Like none of us have enough money to do what we need to do in communities, and finding those unique leverage points and figuring out how you can do that. And I know I gave a little presentation for some of the Utah folks a couple months ago, but you know, I think where the, you know, really thinking about braiding and layering funding is where, you know, I feel like you start to put the concept of shared risk and protective factors into practice. And, you know, Eva's point here around starting small is exactly what we did back in the day, is just saying, hey, like these things seem super related. So let's not make our partners crazy and blend the money on the back, or braid the money on the back end, so that when it goes out to communities, it just makes sense to them. And then you do that enough over time, and it kind of takes off. And I would say for us, you know, we're having, conversations that, you know, even like 3 years ago, I wouldn't have thought maybe were possible around like, okay, like, you know, I want one of the biggest funding sources in our state is our tobacco and chronic disease money. And I want them to direct that money in a way that is working on shared risk and protective factors that also impact injury, violence prevention, and all the other things that we care about. And that is the conversation we're happening right now, but literally it took 20 years. So I think just, you know, continuing and when leaders change, because I think that's also true, at a certain point that, you know, you play around with your language a little bit and what's going to resonate for those particular people and where they come from, and kind of build it over time, and don't be intimidated by just starting and trying something, because that's where you learn lessons and can really expand the work.
Thank you.
Colleen, would you add anything to that about leadership or readiness in general, or?
I mean, I think the only other thing that like comes to my mind is just like being nimble in the language we use. So like I think sometimes and I think that this is like on the slide too, like sometimes that vocabulary you're saying shared risk and protective factor approach doesn't resonate with everyone. And so like, how do you explain what the approach is without necessarily using that phrase? So I think that helps along the way as well.
Excellent. Good. We're gonna keep talking a little bit. Shannon's gonna take us through some of the practical sort of strategies for thinking and addressing some of these things that we've just talked about. But feel free to drop questions in the chat around readiness, and for any of the states, any of the other states, or for safe states. The tongue twister. So Shannon, do you want to?
Yes, and then hopefully I won't drop off. If I do, just keep going.
I don't know these slides. If you drop off, we're done. No.
You're gonna make it up, ad lib. And then also, Catherine, I want to make sure that we have enough time for the health equity conversation, because I think that's really important. So so wave at me or something if you want me to speed it up. Okay.
Okay.
So, and I want to hear from you guys either in the chat, or feel free to interrupt and ask questions or offer your suggestions and thoughts about ways that this might happen for you, or ideas that you have about doing this. But this is really in my experience, the way that you operationalize this framework requires a change in the way that you think, right? Which is why we call it shifting the paradigm. So you have to think differently at a couple of different levels. So I think you have to think differently about how you structure your work unit, whatever you call it. So your branch, your section, your unit, your program, whatever you call it, you need to think about it differently. So how you hire people, the way you deploy those people, how you assess the strengths of those people, I think needs to look differently. And then I think the way that you engage partners, who those partners are, who you fund, how you fund, all of that needs to look differently. So your internal operational kinds of ways that you do your work, and then external. So let's break that down a little bit. So incorporating shared risk and protective factors, in particular the ones that you prioritize across your issues, into your strategic plans. Okay, so for core, you have to have a strategic plan across your work unit, across your IVP work, but you might have to have a strategic plan, you know, internally across division. You might have to have a strategic plan for a particular grant that you're applying for. So thinking about how do you incorporate those risk and protective factors into those sorts of plans. And it kind of speaks a little bit, I think, also to how you communicate about the framework. So you might not say, oh, we should incorporate a shared risk and protective factor into this strategic plan, but you might say, we should consider thinking about how we address economic security, or we might think about how we address connectedness between adults and young people. So thinking about how you incorporate it into these strategic plans. Maintaining a shared risk and protective factor lens when deciding which funding opportunities you pursue. So I think, you know, for a lot of programs, a lot of work units, we tend to go after every nickel that's on the table, right? And because we want to have funding to maintain our staff, and we want to be able to do good injury and violence prevention work. And what we really need to be thinking about is what is our work, and be strategic about sticking to that work. And so when we're thinking about what opportunities we pursue, making sure that those opportunities are aligned with what prioritized risk and protective factors we're working on. So I think Essentials for Childhood is a good example of that. Like that gives you that gave an opportunity to a lot of states to look at work that addressed risk and protective factors as opposed to a particular injury or violence prevention topic. And then staffing appropriately and strategically. I think here, you know, it really means a lot of things. So it means like I might not necessarily think about when I have an opportunity to onboard staff or hire new staff, I might not be looking necessarily for somebody who has a particular expertise in a topic like motor vehicle safety, for example, but I might be looking for somebody who has attributes that align with these sorts of approaches, right? So thinking creatively, innovatively, thinking about how you can braid and blend funding, thinking about approaches that address how you build resilience, how you build connectivity in relationships. Somebody who has a mental health background, and thinking about how mental health connects to other public health sorts of issues. So thinking differently about the kind of staff that you might bring on board to address your injury and violence prevention topics. And then in terms of your organizational structure, I've talked a little bit about that, like how you might organize in a more horizontal way, and thinking about how you set up your structure so that it's not so siloed. So I'm thinking about in Colorado at one point, instead of having like a suicide prevention director, having an injury and violence prevention director, so that you have directors who are thinking across the work unit, right? So they're thinking about unintentional injury as well as intentional injury. And so all of your management is called injury and violence prevention managers or directors. And they're thinking about all of the programming across the branch or across the unit. And so your frame in your organizational structure is a frame that looks at integrating across programs. Let's look at the next slide. Great. And so we've talked a little bit about this, and Lindsay, you were talking about this braiding and blending of funding, leveraging funding. One of the things that Catherine and I often bring up, and we call it attributes, when you're thinking about doing this work, it's not so much the skills as it is the attributes, right? Like risk-taking, being able to do something and ask for forgiveness later. What is that called, Catherine? Like not asking permission first, but asking forgiveness later. That's what it is. That doesn't come naturally for everybody. Does come naturally for Catherine and I think probably Lindsay Myers too. That you just like, I think when you're doing this work, don't assume that the answer is no from your funders, right? It's okay to think creatively about your funding, and your funders might be supportive of these sorts of approaches. And so think about ways that you might leverage funding, and think about ways that you might present approaches that address shared risk and protective factors, and don't assume that your funders are only going to want you to address a particular issue. And so, look for those opportunities. Great, thanks, Lindsay. Looking in the chat, it took us 2 months to get CDC OD 2A staff to let us use opioid money for essentials for childhood. Yeah, and sometimes it takes convincing, right, and pushing and talking about it. And so keep doing that, right? Sometimes you might be on the front end, you might be an early adopter, and you have to bring the funders along. Cross-train staff across issues, and get them comfortable talking about how these risk and protective factors address across issues, particularly unintentional and intentional. Communicate shared risk and protective factor messages in a way that's understandable to your different partners, right? So your community-based organizations, leaders in your departments, as well as outside your departments, decision makers, those who are working across different forms of injury and violence, and communicate it in a way that they can understand it. So you got to know your audience and what's going to speak to them. So it could be that if you're talking to decision makers, the thing that speaks to them is it's going to create efficiencies, or you're going to be able to leverage funding. It could be if you're talking to violence prevention partners in the community, that the thing that they need to hear is that you're going to be able to address multiple forms of violence by addressing this particular protective factor. So really know your audience, and then speak to them in language that they need to hear it in. Don't say lingo like shared risk and protective factors. We just say that to you all because you know that lingo, but know how to speak about what the factors actually are, or what they achieve based on who you're talking to. And then, integration into the community. So what does it mean, boots on the ground? How does it actually look in implementation? Let me pause for a minute. I know there's some stuff in the chat, and in terms of just what this looks like and how you guys have seen it done, or what things you guys have done in terms of shifting the paradigm for some of the states that are further along, like Colorado or Utah. What might you add to this? But also states that are maybe not as far along, what questions do you have about what we've put out here? Lindsay, there's a question for you.
Yeah, it might actually be easier to answer it out loud. I started
yeah.
And Colleen really spoke about this earlier in the example she gave around Essentials for Childhood, but we're braiding dollars from our Overdose Data to Action grant, the actual EFC grant, and our Child Fatality Prevention System, or Child Fatality Review, which has some state funding, to collectively fund local public health agencies in our priority communities to have a full-time person working on food security. And so we, for CDC, had to argue the connection between enrollment in SNAP and WIC and child care assistance programs, and the potential impact on substance use and misuse. And so that took, some time, but there was literature out there. We always like to throw CDC's own documents back at them to say, oh, look how this is how it is. And, and those of you who know anything about overdose data to action, brand new project officers that all came on relatively new, and we're not as familiar with this concept as other, like RPE, for example, is very used to us making this argument in other states as well. And but it was really new for the overdose team. So it took a little bit of convincing, but we, with essentials, it's small dollar amounts. I think we're actually only, Colleen, you might know this better than me, but it's like $10,000 that we're actually giving the local communities from EFC itself, which is not enough to do anything. So, by kind of piecemealing and braiding our funding together, we're able to, on the program side, or at the local public health agency side, they get it in one contract. So they don't really know that we've done this on the back end. We do have to put a little bit of things in there to make sure we are getting some reporting that we need, so that we can then go to each of the different funders that are funding a piece of this and give them the information that that we promised them in our application for that funding. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think basically the opportunity to braid those funding sources really, it allows for our local public health agencies to hire like one FTE to actually coordinate the work at the local level. And then specific to the overdose data action work, we've included some language in our scopes of work with them around community engagement plans and really engaging those at risk for substance misuse or overdose. And so just making sure that that's, part of the conversation in terms of increasing enrollment to WIC, SNAP, and the Colorado Child Care Assistance Program.
Thank you.
I think it's probably maybe almost impossible to overstate the importance of RPE or the strategic use of RPE because of what Lindsay said about how familiar they are, how long RPE has been wrestling with this. So I'd encourage you to think about that. And I don't know the details, but I think North Carolina is another state that's also doing, and I'm assuming that this is, sort of one of the things that happens once one state changes, right? That also has opioid efforts integrated into their Essentials for Childhood. So that might be another place to ask questions. I'm not completely familiar with their strategies, but.
Great, thank you. So continuing the conversation here, I think that's so funny, the correct approach. But it is the correct approach. It's the, right. So, convincing funders and decision makers that this is the approach. And I think, from CDC's point of view, I think that convincing is done. I think they're bought in. And I think you'll see that in the NOFO and have seen that support. I think other funders are probably going to come along as well, but continuing to convince other funders and decision makers that this is the approach, and but using the right language to communicate that. I think that, key is, and you saw this a little bit in what Eva was sharing in terms of the pushback around partners not wanting to get their particular focus area lost in terms of a shared risk and protective factor approach. One of the things that we talk about when we're doing our training is building a theory of change and identifying partners that will be part of your work. And sometimes when you start to take this approach, you lose partners, either partners that just aren't part of this approach and part of this work, and that's okay. And it will mean that you bring on new partners who are, and partners that you may not have thought of that are that weren't traditionally part of your work. But certainly most of your partners will come along with you, and you will have to do some reassuring that their particular area of focus, whatever that is not going to be lost in taking this approach. And I know those of you who have been doing this work have had to do some of that, that reassuring and showing partners that their work and their particular area of focus hasn't been lost. And then, you know, the challenge, especially because we haven't seen a lot of it in the research about measuring risk and protection at the community level. And I'm curious, Lindsay, I know you guys have done some of that with communities that care, if I remember correctly, right? It's been a while since I've looked at that, but are you guys able to measure this at the community level in Colorado?
I'm going to pass that one to Felice because she is much more familiar than me.
Hi, sorry, I was like getting caught in answering a G chat. Will you remind me of the question?
Sorry, Felice. Yeah, and I didn't mean, I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
No,
and
you're good.
Fine if you want to punt it, but I was curious about measuring risk and protective factors at the community level.
Yeah, okay. So one of the cool things about CTC is that we had enough buy-in and support to add some additional measures to our Healthy Kids Colorado survey that helped provide some scaled risk and protective factors, which are actually taken from the model that the people who created CTC, University of Washington, the larger survey that they typically administer. We have a unified survey approach in Colorado, so we really wanted this to be a part of our HKCS survey. But we do have access then to, I believe it's, I want to say 16 risk and protective factors that are directly related to how they do planning and how they choose interventions through the CTC model. And so what's nice about that is they can get that, they get their data sharing agreements in place at that local level so that they can get the information at a more granular level than what we typically share publicly. And then we can also share those data points across different efforts. So it's not just limited to CTC. So other programs in our branch can use these scaled factors, which are a more rigorous way of measuring some of these risk and protective factors that we care about. That's the short answer.
Great. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's sort of the beauty, right, is that that some of these protective factors in particular, you can show change at the community level. And I think that's, that is a nice other shift in the paradigm, but it's also challenging to do. It takes time. Yeah. Other thoughts, Catherine, or other thoughts or questions?
The one thing I'll add here around this is the measuring it. CDC did release some, in the last couple of years, have released some resources out of the Delta Project, which is I would call it for those of you that don't have it, it's essentially the RPE version that's focused on domestic violence, but it's located at community state level nonprofits. It's located usually at state domestic violence coalitions, but there aren't very many funded states. I think there are only 9 of them now. But over the last few years, CDC has released some resources from Delta. Delta's a little bit ahead of RPE in terms of looking at community and societal level factors. So that might be another place to get some support and strategies around this, just FYI, from the project officers or I forget what they're called, the evaluators that work on Delta. Any other thoughts or questions? I know Shannon just went through a lot. We like to pack this slide deck full. Okay. Feel free again to keep dropping things in the chat. This is sort of the extent. Here's the thing also about prioritizing information, right? Is that we don't have a lot of time to kind of drop further into evaluation or measurement. But I do think that there are some good resources out there, depending on where you are in the process. The things I like, this is sort of just another plug for Connections Lab, right? The thing I like about Connections Lab is that what's up there now is pretty conceptual, right? So it's helpful to sort of start thinking about building out the infrastructure for the evaluation, so including the non-technical infrastructure, right? Which is sort of sometimes the harder part when we think about shared risk and protection. And so So yeah, we're happy to answer questions. We're happy to try to connect you to more resources. CDC has a toolkit. There's starting to be more things out there. Different states are starting to do different kinds of work in this area. I think Alaska has some interesting things that are going on. So so this is, I think, the question of the future, right? The $64,000 question is going to be how are we going to get better at this? Not just around shared risk and protective factors, but remember back to the charts where the research was, right? Just understanding those, or where the gaps in research were anyway. Those understanding those exterior levels of the social ecology, right? And moving down. And then also, what are the roles, right? What are the partnership roles? I think a lot of the questions that we need to ask ourselves around our partners or just around this work is about our partners, right? What is shared risk and protective? I mean, going back to sort of what Lindsay or Colleen, I forget who was talking about it, about the definition of the approach, right? How it doesn't root all this stuff in injury and violence, right? So what does it look like if I'm a housing provider? What does shared risk and protective factor look like? What does that work look like for me, right? How does it change the work of folks outside of the health department? And I think that's the question that they're wrestling with in North Carolina in really interesting ways, because the health department wasn't the initial lead of the shared risk and protective factor work that was happening in that state, right? It came out of the state level coalitions, the Sexual Assault Coalition, the DV Coalition. And so that's a really, I think that's going to be a big, just a need for a lot of conversation going forward. So this slide, I won't say a lot about it because I was supposed to delete it and then I forgot to do that. So this slide we put in the deck when we first started doing this presentation, and everyone was a little bit just in crisis, frankly. We were all in crisis at that point. But the one thing I do want to say about this, right, as we think about going forward, both intentional and unintentional injury, right, is that the way that the pandemic, the impact of the pandemic itself, the social and policy response to the pandemic is shifting community level risk, right? So we have to think about this in ways. It's maybe good that we're talking about evaluation of the time that I leave this slide in here, right? Because this is when we're going to talk about health equity next, right? So we're gonna just talk about this intersection in a way that I think, again, we just have a few minutes to do this, so we won't do it justice. But as we go forward, writing this sort of updating this presentation and having these conversations, this question of what risk looks like for what communities, right? The question for how that's evolving in both good and bad ways, and how our policy responses and our social responses impact that. Can be, it's challenging, right? It's a challenging topic anyway. And then when it's always shifting, right? And when it's shifting with the speed it is or the intensity that it is right now, it makes the work kind of different. And maybe, I forget who said it, right? Maybe really makes us more reliant on partnerships than we ever have been, right? And partnerships where we're being led by community partners, right? Who do this work very differently. But so let's start here, right? So talk a little bit about your work. I mean, you can do this either in the chat or you can do this in the, take yourself off mute, but do you all have, how are you integrating or applying an equity lens to your work? How are you defining equity? How are you thinking about that, either as a measurement or as as kind of a strategy in and of itself, the application of an equity lens? Or are people just stumped here? Is this sort of a place where you all are having lots of conversations, but maybe not having? Yes. How do you order the internal and external work, right? It's the chicken and the egg question, right? And so what does that look like? Is that common, or are there other things that folks are wrestling with? So when I think about equity, can't read the chat and advance the slides. You know, I think most simply, right? Like health equity is the idea that our health outcomes, the trajectory of our lives in some ways is predictable, right? And it's predictable based on your zip code. It's predictable based on other other traits or characteristics that that are innate, right, that we're born with. And so the idea is to break that is to break that relationship, right? That we shouldn't be able to predict certain things about what's going to happen based on characteristics of folks. And when we do this in states, in trainings with states, we've started to spend a lot more time here, and that time is really rooted in practicing skills, right? And sort of figuring out where are the decision points, where are the places where we think we are thinking about budgets, or we're thinking about evaluation questions, or we're thinking about programming or strategy design that offer us the opportunity to interrupt what's happening in communities or with our public health systems, right? Because what we know is that it takes absolutely no intention to create disparate outcomes or to create systems and structures that hurt people, right? That are oppressive to people. So it's much easier to do than it is to undo, right? So when we're blinded by the way we've always done things, when we're blinded by privilege, when we're blinded by sort of our own data, we can inadvertently or without intention do a lot of harm, right? But we cannot bumble our way into undoing that harm, I think, is sort of the point that I want to make here, that as we think about this. So when we think about decision points, this is the place where we try to highlight an important intersection between, as you're designing a shared risk and protective factor approach, right? There are those opportunities to make decisions that also can connect that work to equity work, both in the ways that Eva talked about, right, in terms of just the acknowledgement, right? So the first maybe internal piece of work is the acknowledgement of where the expertise lies, where the history lies, who is the best determiner, is that a word, determiner? Who is the best decider about solutions, right? Who knows what's best for communities? And then how do we negotiate that? So health equity plans, I'm seeing in the chat, people are talking about health equity plans, I mean, those are really, really good tools because there are places to hold ourselves accountable, right? There are places to develop measures and to think about things that we need to constantly remind ourselves to think about, right? So I think about, again, part of the reason we show you the triangle in the beginning is so we can knit it back together here, right? So the health impact triangle, right? And so again, we want to think about as many structural ways to change the context in which people live and go to school and work, and then ultimately grow old in, right? Those are the places where we have the potential to make the best impact. And I'm sure, I don't know, this picture, at least the first two panels of it, right, is a very popular picture, right? It's been used for a long time. And there was a lot of critique of it over the years. And so someone finally fixed it, right? which is to make the point, right, that structural problems, we shouldn't necessarily, not every problem is an additive, right? That we don't need to solve everything by creating a program to figure out how to add it, right? And that when we move out in the social ecology and down in that pyramid and address access to resources that create autonomy and self-determination, we can make changes that are wholly different in nature than what we've been doing now, and certainly in cost and effort and the kinds of partnerships that we need. So questions, thoughts, or reactions to the definition or to this slide? People usually have a lot of reaction to this slide, both positive and negative, which is why I like it. a lot of you, you've probably seen this one before, but again, you know, when we think about where we spend our time and where we spend our money, right? So in healthcare, we spend a lot of money in this country down here in this bottom 20%, right? Trying to figure out how to shift the clinical experiences of people. In public health, we spend a lot of time here in health behaviors, right? So we have whole schools that are focused only on health behaviors, right? And so I think the point, you know, of this slide is to really kind of show the combination of emphasis and where we're missing, right? This is a very easy gap analysis when you think about what our work is and how we're focusing it, right? And so shifting towards this, you know, 50 to 80% of healthcare that's driven by socioeconomic factors, right? So when we think about a lot of the health behaviors that we work to address, how many times do we think about you know, sort of the social trauma or the racial trauma that's at the root of some of these behaviors, right? Those aren't the strategies that we're implementing when we think about this work. And so thinking about, you know, part of what we practice when we go through this a little bit more in depth are actually taking state strategies and doing racial equity impact analyses with them, right? So how do you get in a small group and answer a series of questions or figure out what data you need to understand what the impact on particular populations is going to be based on how you make decisions for your programs. Hopefully you've all seen this before, right? So this is the healthy people. What are we at 2030 now? I always forget. It's 20. I don't know how long we have to get healthy this time, but I think it's 2030, right? So this is sort of it reminds me of a wedding cake, right? I'm not sure why. I don't really, but I think that I think it's a helpful. It can be a helpful picture. If not a little cliche in terms of how do we continue to remind ourselves or remind our partners, right? And then to think about, again, where are the social determinants of health or where are the social drivers of health where we need to think about risk and protection, right? So this is, again, sort of where, I mean, you know, Lindsay, this, you know, we joke about the abstract, right? Because I have that brain, right? I can spend all day in the abstract around this conversation, but sooner or later you have to drop into sort of what does that look like actually changing things in the community, right? So the things that Felice is going to measure. And so I think thinking structurally about what we look like inside, this is sort of just a flat version of the pyramid, right? So this is a sort of like where is it we want to be in public health, and what is it we want to be addressing to think about the ways that these push these are the how do I want to say this, that the risk and protective factors that we can identify and shift to address these kinds of things, right? So I've been doing a lot of reading lately about social capital, I guess you could say, but really kind of what does it take to build connectedness, right? And so you know, to our best knowledge, what we need are we need social infrastructure, right? So we need people to be able to have relationships, and we need physical environments that don't impede those, right? So blight is a problem, right? But I read this great book about the heat wave in Chicago in the mid-90s, right? That killed about 2,000 people in one day in the city. And one of the things that they figured out when they looked at sort of how the heat had impacted communities across the city, that there were a number of communities in the south side of Chicago, so heavily burdened communities, Black communities, that actually fared really well relative to other communities that were wealthier, mostly white people, right? And so when they went in to try to figure out what happened, part of this idea of social infrastructure and the ability of people to have not only have relationships, but understand what to do when things went wrong, right? So they checked on people that lived at the top floor of an apartment building, right? Or if someone didn't show up somewhere, somebody else noticed, right? So there are these this is what I was talking about in the beginning, about these elements of connectedness that we need to tease out to really understand what it is we're doing, right? And to really understand what it is that we need to build a strategy to do this work. And this is the work, again, that we can't do without partners, right? We're not equipped to do it currently. I think back to Felice's point about what do we do internally and externally first. And then how do we, even when we get good at it, or even when we have a plan, a solid plan for it, we can't do it without the communities themselves, right? We can't do it without understanding what folks think is most important to them. And that's sort of this circle, this giant circle, right? Is sort of both the focus and then this where we want to focus our work, and then how we want to center our work. And both of those things are true. So reactions to this slide, or anything I've said so far, agreements, disagreements. Whoops, sorry about that. It's not gonna let, don't look, because it's gonna make me start all over again. That'd make you car sick, right? Thoughts or reactions? And Shannon, I'll let you monitor the chat while I bring us back to. How are those of you, I mean, Utah and Colorado, like, we keep putting you on the spot, but maybe other folks who are doing some, what do your conversations look like, right? How are you having conversations around health equity and shared risk and protection at this point, or even just about partners, right? One of the things we hear a lot in the assessment that Eva and Carly described was that a lot of partners in the community will say, we're already doing this work, right? We just call it health equity, right? So, and like Carly said, we've been doing it for, like, where have you been, right? So how are you all having those conversations?
I think in Utah, one of the things that kind of happened, and I think we kind of realized it with shared risk and protective factors, that there was kind of a group with us within our violence and injury prevention program that understood it, that kind of just like took lead and, you know, went forward with the strategic plan, went forward with partnerships. And then we realized that like everybody in our program didn't necessarily understand shared risk and protective factors as well. So we actually needed to take a step back and do more internal training for our staff. So I think that kind of goes over into, you know, when we start to include health equity work into what we're doing, kind of taking a step back and realizing that we need to do more staff training initially to kind of get everybody in our own program on board. And then that, not to say other work isn't occurring at the same time, but that's really like a core pillar of kind of where we are right now, and just making sure that our program is comfortable with the language, our program is comfortable with how it gets implemented, so that everybody in our program can kind of come and bring ideas about how this work will influence the rest of our work, if that makes sense. So how we're doing that on a practical level is that we just have like health equity trainings every month that are required. So just like readings and videos that we ask staff to look at. It fits into kind of our you know, personal development goals that we already have, but it just has a health equity lens now. And then we have an optional reading group as well. So we have a book club that's optional. People read books every 2 months and then get together to talk about them.
I was just going to say, we're doing some similar things in Colorado as well. But I think something that you touched on, Catherine, and not using these words, but kind of that concept of nothing about us without us. And so really ensuring that we're communicating with communities about and taking into account their lived experience and their expertise in their communities and what solutions they're looking for. And so as we're building out our kind of equity plan within our branch, we're trying to connect with community more to get their guidance on what that should look like, and also recognizing where we're missing connections with community as well, I think has been important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, and you know, we're also having conversations around, you know, what barriers, or, you know, where are we hammering the baseball fence in there and creating the barrier to actually working with the communities who hold the answers to the problems that they're facing, and they're helping create the inequities. And so, you know, looking at, you know, where, and it's hard in a state agency that is so built in systems of oppression. Like, that's the foundation, and that's true for the country as a whole, but particularly like in funding structures and things in state government. And so, you know, where is it that like we're never going to have the right partners, because the right partners are very small nonprofits led by communities of color that are never going to, you know, be able to have capacity necessarily to fund our grants, because we put up so many barriers and things. And so, you know, trying, and it's hard. Like we're making small little tiny wins here or there to try to break down some of the structural things just in how we look at, you know, reimbursement-based funding for communities, for example, or, you know, we have one project that I'm really excited about because we're working through a third party, you know, intermediary who's then funding and working and building capacity of the communities that are doing the right work for the right communities. And, you know, those types of things, and trying to build on that and learn as we do about how we can incorporate that better and better. And I think we use this picture a lot in our work. And I think what's great about it is, you know, if you go to communities and say, what are your problems? These are the things that they're going to say on the, you know, on the left-hand side there. And there is actually all sorts of funding sources out there that are meant to target those things. And so how can you know, I think it helps with some of the language stuff, because you're talking about, you know, what is the what? Like, what are we actually talking about, and not in you know, the lingo that we all get seeped in sometimes.
Right. And the potential now, right? The potential for funding directed at these, right? So I mean, you know, we can all be hopeful, right? I forget what this new bill is, right? But the potential that the funding, that we need to be ready maybe for a different kind of funding environment around these conversations, I think is also part of that, Lindsay, right? That you're, you know, other thoughts or comments? I mean, I think the thing that I would add is, you know, I was a bureaucrat long enough to know, right, that if it's not in your budget or your evaluation, it doesn't actually matter to you, right? Like you can't, it won't stand the test of time, right? So I would encourage you to look for places to institutionalize this work, right? And whether that's like Lindsay saying, what are the internal metrics, right, or that end up driving your budget, whether that's a strategic plan or the budget itself, or the funding that you go after to support your work, or whether it's being able to define actual outcomes early, right? Even if those are learning outcomes or partnership outcomes, or external surveys of the perception of your organization or things like that. So yeah, there's a lot more to be said here. And I think it's always the challenge of a 3-hour training, and a lot of skills that I think we all need to sort of focus on. But yeah, I think this is a good slide. I think Lindsay, what you were saying is good in terms of being able to pick those places that being able to identify sort of where the barriers are and who's missing and why, right? What is it that we are doing that's not meeting the needs of other folks, and what's changeable to do that? So I think hopefully, right, this circle alone makes it sort of, you know, really highlights the intersection of where shared risk and protection and these social drivers of health that often make up health equity conversations just overlap and can be leveraged against each other. So in the last 15, 12 minutes or so that we have, I want to maybe let's spend the next like 15 minutes talking a little bit about sort of what you all need, right? And this, I think, will be helpful for Colleen to hear in terms of the region itself. You know, what going forward, both around the NOFO or around this work larger, feel free to drop it in the chat or take yourself off mute. But let's just spend a few minutes talking about this. What would you like to learn, dive more deeper in? What do you need from the region, from the RNCO, from Colorado? What do you need from each other, or what would you like to have from each other? What would you like to have that is bigger data or bigger information? What would you like to have from CDC?
I don't know if this is an option from CDC, but I was chatting with Lindsay earlier in the session that I would love to see the connecting the dots tool updated, but I think with turnover at the CDC, I'm not sure if that's going to happen. But yeah, as Catherine mentioned, I would definitely love to hear your ideas so we can think about next steps for our NCO between now and like the end of the grant year, which is end of July, and just thinking of ways that we can support you all in continuing this work. And I know Nebraska is partnering with Safe States and HMA to do a readiness assessment soon. So it would be nice to like hear how that progress goes, you know, over the next several months from Nebraska. Yeah, Benny, I was thinking similarly. Maybe that's something to include in your capacity building cooperative agreement, Safe States.
I think the technical packages should go in there too, right? I think those could all use an update.
Yeah,
I feel like I was joking with Colleen earlier that I was like, of course, you know, like they're outdated just when everyone's tired of getting it. So that's how those things go.
What other things? Anything else that you can think of? I know it's a hard question, right? It's deceptively simple on the screen, but like,
I don't know how to put this into like a concisive ask, but I always feel like there needs to be kind of more connections between like the research that's going on around shared risk and protective factors and the practice. So maybe some type of translation science at the community level that kind of supports states in evaluating what's already happening in communities, but just within a shared risk and protective factor model, because I think that there's already a lot of great work being done in this area. But how do we kind of elevate that or make it useful for minority populations that, you know, are difficult to replicate the work or do research on?
and I think there's a NOFO out right now, right? An evaluation, shared risk and protective factor evaluation, RFP might be an opportunity for that. I haven't looked at it.
And having in the chat, having quick and handy access to the research would be helpful. From Dana.
Yeah. Benny, do you remember when CDC with the RPE program tried to do that rapid response where they tried to churn out research summaries really quickly? Were you? It was a colossal failure, not surprisingly, but they it was an attempt, to push research out really quickly in the form of research briefs. And this, I mean, I think this would be a great area to build an infrastructure like that. Because it's so dynamic right now and because there's such a high need for it, but they're not good at it.
Well, along that line, one of the things I was thinking about was getting the like ASTO or APHA on board with this idea, you know, would be another way to get it out on a bigger scale, but that's work at the national level. But anyway.
Yeah. That's I mean, there's a strategy opportunity, I guess, right? For both the region and then this core states across the country to think about that.
And I think even though they're probably not going to call it a shared risk and protective factor approach in this way, but you know, I think with COVID and everyone's, you know, rightfully very worried about what the economic impacts, lasting economic impacts and connectedness and, you know, all of this stuff, I think that we're going to see a lot coming out and work where, you know, maybe that contributes over time because we're going to, you know, I think people once the pandemic is in a place where we can kind of transition into whatever the next phase looks like, I think it's going to be a big topic of conversation, particularly as it relates to mental health and behavioral health. And we know that those things are tied to everything else. So I think that I think there'll be some interesting things coming out.
Yeah, I was sitting on a different project with a bunch of, I don't know what these people are called, like political strategists, right? The people who tell candidates what to do, right? How to talk about things. And one of them was talking about the research around atomization. And I was surprised at the extent to which politicians have research about how connected or disconnected we are and the ways that that's true for us, right? And so I think you're right, Lindsay, that there's, I think, a lot of conversation that will be coming around that in general, because we have no choice, right? Because this is, when we start evicting people in mass, or when people start to notice we're evicting people in mass and people continue to die, maybe, sooner or later, hopefully sooner, now that we're back to science and those kinds of tools that will shift. But any other thoughts, any parting thoughts or questions, either for us or for Colleen, about what it is you'd like to see next, or for each other? I mean, even feel free to share thoughts with each other or safe states.
I just wanted to thank Safe States and HMA for facilitating the discussion today and giving everybody this information about shared risk and protective factors and readiness assessments. And if there's any follow-up that you think of after the meeting, definitely reach out to me so that, or there's any needs, or if you're like, yeah, I think our state could be ready to do a readiness assessment, let's talk about how our RNCO can support that work as well if possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's anything we can do to help, if you have questions for us, by all means, feel free to reach out. This is how you get Shannon or I. Here's the general Safe States email address, is the word I'm looking for here. Carly and Eva, I didn't know if that was the best place to send folks. So if you have a different alternative you want to drop in the chat, feel free. But yeah, thank you. This is always so much fun to do. And it's always fun to do the regional ones. They're very different than the state specific because there's so much more going on and such a different, people are working in such different contexts. So it's very thrilling to me. Shannon, do you want to add or say anything about the last couple sections, or just goodbye? And Eva and Carly, you as well?
No, I mean, just goodbye. I wouldn't hold people on the line when we're in the last few minutes blabbering on. Enjoy your Friday afternoon, enjoy your weekend, and it was good to see everybody.
Yeah, it's 5 o'clock East Coast time, or 4 o'clock East Coast time. So I think both Carly and I are thankful for you guys having us, and we're happy to have been here.
Yes.
Yes, thanks very much.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for your time. It's nice to see you all. Barbara Gabella, Lindsay, people I haven't seen in a long time. Benny. So have a good weekend and be safe. Wash your hands, right?
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.